Progress is a word rarely used when discussing COP summits, which is why climate adaptation is beginning to gain more support. But where are we currently with this? Have we made progress? Are we miles behind where we need to be? Let's have a look in more detail. A November 2023 report by the UN currently shows that there is a widening finance gap somewhere between $194 billion and $366 billion per year. In simpler terms, the world's financial needs for climate adaptation funding are 10 to 18 times higher than what is financially available globally. And to put this in figures, it will take an estimated 0.8% of all developing countries' GDP combined to actually get there. 5 out of 6 nations involved in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have at least one adaptation plan. And according to the report, the growing effectiveness of these policies have increased since 2021. However, 1 in 6 nations still don't have any adaptation plans, and while half of the 29 countries without a plan are in the process of creating one, they also happen to be amongst the most vulnerable to changes in climatic conditions, which matched with a lack of funds is concerning. For example, financial flows to developing countries decreased by 15% to $21.3 billion in 2021, after having increased to $25.2 billion between 2018 and 2020. And the weakening support from the 4 international climate funds will make this harder to achieve by 2025. It isn't all bad news though on the finance front. There has been a growth in financial value of adaptation projects despite the lack of support. There's been a steady increase in climate mitigation projects, meaning projects that try to mitigate climate events before they happen, showing that change in other fields of climate finance are possible, and so are therefore possible in adaptation projects. But even if we hit the goals, will it be enough? The report states that increases in international public finance alone is unlikely to get close to filling in the finance gap. For example, achieving the goal of doubling adaptation finance by 2025 would reduce the gap by only 5 to 10%. So if the gap is too large, then what is the point, you might ask? Is investment not better spent elsewhere, like preventing climate change in the first place? Not necessarily. There are still very real benefits for the most disadvantaged. For example, $16 billion invested in agriculture per year would prevent a projected 78 million people from starving because of climate change impacts. And every $1 billion invested in adaptation against coastal flooding leads to a $14 billion reduction in economic damages globally. Climate change can also exacerbate inequality in multiple dimensions of social identity, such as gender, ethnicity, and age, and is looking likely to, as only 20% of current adaptation projects have socially inclusive considerations. So what should be done with the finance available? Damages in the 55 most climate vulnerable economies alone exceeded $500 billion over the past 2 decades, and are expected to rise if little adaptation occurs. But globally, these numbers are still uncertain, and this is a problem. For example, many countries haven't calculated their loss and damages due to climate change, so their financial needs are still relatively unknown, and perhaps the complexity of the matter will always make this difficult. This is why innovative forms of finance need to be looked at to deal with the complexity of losses and damages. Just some examples include the more familiar, like insurance and grants, and more innovative solutions like debt swaps and aviation taxes. What is clear from this report is that the most vulnerable communities, mostly in developing countries, will be affected most strongly by climate change, which is why funds such as the Adaptation Fund that has already allocated $850 million was set up. So what are just some adaptation projects underway? In Costa Rica, small farmers are dealing with an increased level of droughts and floods by adapting the breed of their cattle to be drought resistant, as well as improvements in drainage and ecosystem restoration. In Ghana, women farmers are diversifying their livelihoods due to unpredictable rainfall, so now create products like soy milk and shea butter that fetch a good price in their local markets. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, farmers have modified crop production to deal with droughts, such as moving from apples to warmth-adapted peaches. In Albania, a country that is projected to be hardest hit in Europe by coastal erosion, is restoring vegetation on lagoons in an effort to protect shoreline communities, whilst also creating a corridor for migrating birds. In the United States, Miami is raising street levels and developing green infrastructure, And in Latin America and the Caribbean, there has been an attempt to provide nature-based adaptation solutions to urban environments, as 8 in 10 people live in urbanized areas in these regions, 48% of which are judged to be at an extreme risk by the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. In summary, adaptation efforts are happening all over the world as the ineffectiveness of global climate action has shown itself more clearly. But investment is still lacking, which is concerning for the most vulnerable communities. As Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, states, "We are in an adaptation emergency. We must act like it and take steps to close the adaptation gap now."